The fluorescent lights of courtroom 302 cast a harsh, unforgiving glare across Judge William Parker's weathered face as he massaged his temples, desperately willing away the migraine threatening to overtake him. 23 cases, and it wasn't even noon. The coffee on his bench had long since gone cold, a fitting metaphor for his depleting patience. "Next case," he barked, not bothering to look up from the stack of papers before him. The familiar shuffle of feet approaching the defendant's podium barely registered in his consciousness. The morning had been a parade of excuses: expired meters, ignored parking tickets, minor traffic violations, each defendant armed with what they believed was a unique and compelling reason for their transgression. Judge Parker had heard them all, or so he thought, dispensing what he considered justice with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd spent 15 years on the bench. Dr. Maya Richardson stood before him, though he hadn't bothered to notice her properly yet. She'd rushed to the courthouse straight from the university archives, where she'd been deep in research for her upcoming publication. Her casual blazer and jeans, comfortable attire for hours of academic work, felt suddenly inappropriate under the formal scrutiny of the courtroom. The Stanford class ring on her finger caught the fluorescent light as she adjusted the strap of her leather messenger bag, still heavy with academic papers. Case number 47,892. The court clerk announced, her voice carrying a slight tremor that seemed out of place for such a routine matter. Dr. Maya Richardson, charged with an expired parking violation on University Avenue, outside the Maxwell Library. Judge Parker's pen scratched against paper as he made a note, his movements sharp and irritated. "Another university student," he muttered, just loud enough for those in the front row to hear. The assumption hung heavy in the air, adding to the already thick tension in the room. "Your Honor," Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying the measured confidence of someone accustomed to commanding lecture halls and conference rooms. "I understand the seriousness of. Do you know how many students I see and hear every day?" Judge Parker interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes, bloodshot from hours of reading citations, narrowed as they fell upon Dr. Richardson. "All of you thinking the rules don't apply just because you're getting an education." A young law clerk in the corner dropped her pen, the plastic clatter echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. The clerk's eyes darted between the judge and Dr. Richardson, picking up on something in the air that felt decidedly wrong about this interaction. Dr. Richardson stood perfectly still, her posture straight but not rigid, emanating a dignity that seemed to intensify under the judge's dismissive gaze. The handle of her messenger bag creased under her tightened grip, the only visible sign of her growing frustration. "Your Honor, if I may explain." She tried again, her tone remaining professional despite the judge's condescension. "I was conducting research in the Maxwell Library archives when." "The sign clearly states 2-hour parking." Judge Parker cut in again, tapping his pen against the citation. "It's not complicated. These rules exist for a reason, young lady. The university doesn't grant special privileges." The young lady comment rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped in still water. Several observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A seasoned bailiff, who had worked with Judge Parker for over a decade, glanced at his shoes, suddenly finding them fascinating. Unknown to Judge Parker, Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed silently in her bag, another reminder about her keynote speech at the governor's law symposium that evening, where she would be discussing modern interpretations of constitutional law before the state's most prestigious legal minds. The irony of her current situation might have been amusing if it weren't so frustrating. The morning sun had finally broken through the high windows of courtroom 302, creating long shadows that seemed to underscore the distance between the raised bench and where Dr. Richardson stood. In that moment, as Judge Parker shuffled his papers with obvious impatience, neither of them could have predicted how their paths would cross again, or how this seemingly routine morning would catalyze a profound change in the way justice was administered in this very courtroom. The tension in courtroom 302 had become palpable, thick enough to make even the most seasoned attorneys shift uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Maya Richardson stood her ground, her Stanford ring catching the light as she gestured precisely, attempting once more to explain her situation. The young clerk behind Judge Parker had stopped pretending to type, her fingers hovering motionless over the keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Dr. Richardson began again, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used when addressing hostile questions at academic conferences. "I was in the Maxwell Library's restricted archives, working on time-sensitive research when—" "Ms. Richardson," Judge Parker interrupted, deliberately dropping her professional title, "this court sees dozens of people every day, each with their own special reason for believing they're above the law." He leaned forward, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, peering at her with what he clearly thought was instructive authority. The slight tightening around Dr. Richardson's eyes was the only indication that the dismissal of her title had registered. She'd experienced this before, the subtle delegitimization, the small acts of professional erasure. But after 20 years in academia, 3 published books, and countless lectures at the world's most prestigious institutions, she'd learned to navigate these waters with grace. "The signage clearly states 2 hours," Judge Parker continued, his voice rising slightly. "The officer's notes indicate your vehicle was there for nearly 4. Are you suggesting the officer's report is incorrect?" His tone carried the weight of someone who'd already decided the outcome, merely going through the motions of due process. A law student observing court proceedings that day frantically scribbled notes, sensing she was witnessing something significant, though she couldn't quite articulate what. The bailiff, a veteran of countless proceedings, subtly shook his head, recognizing the familiar signs of the judge's mounting frustration. "No, Your Honor," Dr. Richardson responded, maintaining her composure. "I'm merely trying to explain that I had received prior authorization from the library's administrative office for extended parking, due to the nature of my research. I have the documentation here." She reached for her messenger bag, but Judge Parker's sharp voice cut through the air. "Ms. Richardson, this court's time is valuable. If you had such documentation, it should have been submitted with your initial response to the citation." He shuffled the papers before him with evident irritation. "Your failure to follow proper procedures doesn't constitute an emergency on the court's part." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Dr. Richardson, whose latest paper on procedural justice in municipal courts was sitting in her bag, awaiting final revisions. Her phone buzzed again, another reminder about the evening symposium, where she would be addressing a room full of the state's most distinguished legal scholars. "Furthermore," Judge Parker continued, warming to his theme, "this kind of disregard for community rules is exactly what we're trying to discourage. The university's proximity to the courthouse doesn't grant anyone special privileges." His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who delivered this particular lecture many times before. A young attorney waiting for his case to be called watched with growing discomfort, recognizing in Judge Parker's behavior something he'd seen too often in his brief career: the casual dismissal of certain defendants based on appearance and assumptions. Dr. Richardson stood perfectly still, her mind racing through years of similar experiences: the security guard who'd followed her through the Harvard Law Library, the conference organizer who'd assumed she was part of the catering staff, the countless times she'd had to produce ID to enter her own office building. Each incident had strengthened her resolve to change the system from within. "Your Honor," she tried one final time, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest, "if you would allow me to present the documentation." "This court has heard enough," Judge Parker declared, his gavel hovering meaningfully. "The time for documentation was before this hearing. Perhaps this will serve as a lesson in following proper procedures and respecting community regulations." The young clerk had finally resumed typing, but her keystrokes were soft and hesitant, as if she were trying to minimize her participation in what was unfolding. Through the high windows of courtroom 302, clouds had begun to gather, casting shifting shadows across the proceedings, nature's own commentary on the justice being dispensed below. Judge Parker's gavel came down with a crack that echoed through courtroom 302, the sound sharp enough to make several observers flinch. $500, he pronounced, the maximum fine for a parking violation, his voice carrying the weight of what he believed to be justified authority. Plus court costs. Dr. Richardson's hands, clasped before her, tightened imperceptibly. The fine wasn't about the money. Her position as a visiting scholar at 3 prestigious universities meant such an amount was hardly devastating. It was about the principle, about the way justice was being dispensed with such casual disregard for context and circumstance. Additionally, Judge Parker continued, seemingly encouraged by his own momentum, "I'm requiring you to attend a 4-hour traffic safety course." He adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the document before him. Perhaps that will provide some perspective on the importance of following municipal regulations. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the regulars, the court reporters, the clerks, the attorneys waiting their turn, recognized this as excessive. The young law student who had been taking notes suddenly stopped writing, her pen hovering above the page as she processed the disparity between the offense and the punishment. Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed again in her bag. This time, a message from the symposium organizers confirming the evening schedule. In just 6 hours, she would be standing before the governor's law symposium, delivering a keynote address on equity and bias in modern judicial systems. The irony was almost painful. "Your Honor," she spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the circumstances, "I would like to register my objection to both the fine and the additional requirement. This seems disproportionate to the—" "Objection noted." Judge Parker cut her off, already reaching for the next case file. "Pay the fine within 30 days and register for the course within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties." He didn't even look up as he delivered these final instructions, his dismissal complete. The bailiff stepped forward, a subtle indication that her time before the bench was over. As Dr. Richardson gathered her belongings, a young attorney in the gallery caught her eye and offered a small apologetic shake of his head. He'd seen this before. They all had, but something about this particular instance felt different, more egregious. As she turned to leave, Dr. Richardson's Stanford ring caught the light once more, a brief flash of gold that seemed to underscore everything that Judge Parker had failed to see. Her steps were measured and dignified as she walked down the center aisle, her messenger bag heavy with academic papers, including her latest research on judicial bias in municipal courts. Behind her, Judge Parker was already calling the next case, his voice carrying the same stern authority, unaware that his actions today would soon return to haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. The young clerk watched Dr. Richardson's departure, then glanced at the judge, a troubled expression crossing her face as she considered what she'd witnessed. Outside the courtroom, Dr. Richardson paused to check her phone. Among the symposium notifications was an email from her publisher about her upcoming book on systemic bias in the American justice system. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile, the kind that comes from understanding that sometimes the universe has its own way of proving your point. The courthouse corridors were busy with the usual flutter of legal activity, attorneys hurrying between courtrooms, clients consulting in hushed tones, clerks shuttling documents. But Dr. Richardson stood still for a moment, her academic mind already processing the morning's events through the lens of her research. This wouldn't just be another statistic in her data set. This would become a case study in her next lecture series. As she pushed through the heavy courthouse doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, Dr. Richardson was already mentally revising portions of her evening speech. Sometimes the most powerful examples of systemic bias came not from historical records or academic studies, but from lived experience, even if those enforcing the bias couldn't yet see their own role in perpetuating it. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Law Center gleamed under crystal chandeliers, a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent lighting of courtroom 302. Judge William Parker adjusted his bow tie, feeling perfectly at ease among the city's legal elite. After all, this was his world, or so he believed. The annual Governor's Law Symposium had always been a highlight of his professional calendar, a place where his position commanded automatic respect. "William," good to see you." Dean Robert Matthews of the State Law School approached, champagne flute in hand. "We have quite a treat tonight. Our keynote speaker is absolutely brilliant. Just wait until you hear her perspective on constitutional law." Judge Parker nodded politely, only half listening as he surveyed the room. State Supreme Court justices mingled with prominent attorneys and legal scholars, their comfortable laughter floating above the gentle classical music playing in the background. He recognized most faces. This was, after all, a relatively small circle at this level. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean Matthews' voice suddenly boomed through the microphone, calling the evening to order. "If you'll please take your seats, we're about to begin our keynote address." The rustle of expensive fabric filled the air as the audience settled into their chairs. Judge Parker found himself at a prime table near the front, his nameplate gleaming next to those of other distinguished judges and legal scholars. "Our speaker tonight," Dean Matthews continued, his voice warm with admiration, "has redefined our understanding of constitutional law in the modern era. Her latest book spent 20 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and her research has been cited in 3 recent Supreme Court decisions." Judge Parker reached for his water glass, only half listening to what he assumed would be another dry academic presentation. "She's advised 3 presidents on constitutional matters, recently received the MacArthur Genius Grant, and is currently serving as a visiting scholar at 3 of our nation's top law schools." The dean's voice swelled with pride as he continued. "Her work on bias in the judicial system has revolutionized how we think about modern justice. Please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Maya Richardson." The sound of shattering glass drew several startled looks as Judge Parker's water glass slipped from his fingers. But few noticed, as most eyes were fixed on the striking figure approaching the podium. There, ascending the steps with graceful confidence, was the same woman he had dressed down in his courtroom mere hours ago. Dr. Richardson had transformed from her earlier casual research attire into an elegant evening gown, her academic credentials now as visible as her natural dignity. The Stanford ring that had caught the fluorescent lights of his courtroom now gleamed under the ballroom's chandeliers, but this time its significance was unmistakable. As she took her place at the podium, Dr. Richardson's eyes swept the room with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention in such prestigious gatherings. For a brief moment, her gaze met Judge Parker's, and though her expression never changed, he felt the weight of recognition pass between them. "Thank you, Dean Matthews," she began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she had attempted to use in court. "Tonight, I'd like to discuss the subtle ways bias manifests in our judicial system, particularly in what we often dismiss as routine cases." Judge Parker felt the color drain from his face as several colleagues at his table nodded appreciatively at her opening remarks. The same voice he had repeatedly interrupted hours ago now held the rapt attention of every legal luminary in the state. From his position in the front row, there was nowhere to hide. Every word she spoke seemed to carry a double meaning, though her speech never once directly referenced their earlier encounter. He sat rigid in his chair, the remnants of his shattered water glass still scattered at his feet, a fitting metaphor for his shattered assumptions. Dr. Richardson's voice filled the grand ballroom with practiced precision as she continued her keynote address. "Consider the case of Thompson v. State," she said, her eyes occasionally sweeping across the audience, passing over Judge Parker with professional detachment. A routine traffic violation that revealed deeply rooted systemic biases in our municipal courts. Judge Parker's collar felt increasingly tight as he sat in his front row seat, unable to escape the growing parallels between her examples and his own courtroom conduct mere hours ago. His fingers nervously traced the rim of his newly replaced water glass, the shards of his previous one having been quietly cleaned away by hotel staff. "In our research," Dr. Richardson continued, expertly clicking to the next slide, "we found that judges often made snap decisions based on appearance and perceived social status, particularly in what they considered routine cases." A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. Several heads nodded in agreement, completely unaware of the morning's events in courtroom 302. The PowerPoint presentation displayed a graph showing disparities in fine amounts across different demographics. Judge Parker felt a bead of sweat form at his temple as he recognized his own sentencing patterns in the data. The maximum fine he'd imposed earlier that day now felt like a lead weight in his stomach. But perhaps most telling, Dr. Richardson's voice took on a thoughtful tone, is how these biases often manifest in subtle exchanges. The dismissal of credentials, the interruption of explanations, the assumption of guilt rather than presumption of innocence, even in minor infractions. A Supreme Court justice seated at Judge Parker's table leaned forward, clearly engaged. "Brilliant analysis," she whispered to her colleague. "This is exactly what we need to address in our judicial training programs." Each word from Dr. Richardson's presentation felt like a precisely aimed arrow, though she never once looked directly at him. Her Stanford ring caught the light as she gestured toward another slide, reminding Judge Parker of how he'd dismissed its significance earlier. Now, surrounded by his peers, he understood the weight of everything he'd failed to see. "The data suggests," she continued, pulling up a new chart, "that these biases are most prevalent in what we consider minor cases, parking violations, traffic infractions, small claims. It's in these routine matters that we often see the most pronounced examples of systemic prejudice." Judge Parker's notebook remained unopened before him, his pen untouched. Unlike his colleagues, who were furiously taking notes, he sat in paralyzed reflection. Every example she cited, every pattern she identified, forced him to confront his own behavior in ways he'd never considered. When we examine the language used in these proceedings, Dr. Richardson clicked to a slide showing transcript excerpts. We often find a pattern of interruption and dismissal, particularly when defendants attempt to present documentation or explanation. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle across the room. This raises serious questions about access to justice, even in our most basic court proceedings. The irony was excruciating. Just hours ago, he had exemplified every behavior. She was now methodically dissecting before the state's most prestigious legal minds. His own words from that morning echoed back at him through the lens of her scholarly analysis, stripped of their authority and exposed for what they truly were, prejudice masked as procedure. As Dr. Richardson moved toward her conclusion, Judge Parker noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The carefully constructed image he'd held of himself as a fair and impartial jurist was cracking under the weight of her evidence-based presentation. The mirror she held up to the justice system reflected his own face with uncomfortable clarity. "In conclusion," she said, her voice carrying the same dignified tone she'd maintained in his courtroom, "true justice requires constant self-examination and a willingness to confront our own biases, especially in cases we consider routine or beneath careful consideration." The room erupted in appreciative applause, but Judge Parker's hands remained still in his lap, each word of her closing statement settling like a verdict in his conscience. The digital clock on Judge Parker's desk glowed 3:17 a.m., its red numbers casting a faint crimson hue across the scattered papers covering his home office. He'd been there since returning from the symposium, his bow tie long discarded, his starched shirt wrinkled from hours of restless movement. The fifth cup of coffee sat cooling beside him, untouched, as he pored over case files from the past 6 months. Computer, printer, research materials, he muttered, reading from yet another citation he'd issued. The defendant had been carrying academic supplies to her car. Maximum fine. Just like today. Just like Dr. Richardson. His computer screen illuminated his haggard face with harsh clarity as he scrolled through statistics on judicial bias. The numbers seemed to blur together, yet patterns emerged that he couldn't unsee. Column after column of data told the same story, one he'd been unwittingly contributing to for years. The leather chair creaked as he leaned back, running his hands over his face. On his desk, Dr. Richardson's latest published paper lay open, downloaded and printed shortly after he'd returned home. Implicit bias in municipal courts, a statistical analysis. Her words from the symposium had been measured, academic. But here, in the solitude of his study, the raw data felt like a personal indictment. "Jesus," he whispered, picking up another case file. A young woman, doctoral candidate, given the maximum fine for an expired meter while defending her dissertation. He'd dismissed her explanation without even reading the supporting documentation, just like today. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter, a law student herself. "Dad, you okay? You left the symposium pretty quickly." He couldn't bring himself to respond. How could he explain that everything he thought he knew about his own fairness had been upended in a single day? The wall of his study, lined with legal certificates and awards, seemed to mock him now. Distinguished Service to Justice, Raid 1 plaque, its gold lettering catching the dim light. He turned it face down, unable to bear its accusation. Rising unsteadily, Judge Parker moved to his filing cabinet, pulling out more records. Each case file told a similar story: quick judgments, dismissed explanations, maximum penalties. He'd always prided himself on being tough but fair. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, that self-image crumbled like ancient parchment. Standard procedure, he'd always called it. Maintaining order in the court. The justifications that had once seemed so solid now rang hollow in his ears. A yellow legal pad beside him filled with tallies: gender, race, academic status, fine amounts. The pattern was undeniable, even to his resistant mind. The morning's interaction with Dr. Richardson played on repeat in his memory, but now he saw it through new eyes. Her composed dignity, despite his dismissal. The Stanford ring he'd ignored. The documentation he'd refused to review. Each detail twisted in his gut like a knife. Outside his study window, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. He'd been there all night, surrounded by the evidence of his own biases, unable to look away from the truth he'd discovered about himself. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but sleep was impossible now. On his computer screen, an email draft sat open. "Dear Dr. Richardson." He'd started and deleted it a dozen times since midnight. What could he possibly say? How does one apologize for not just a single incident, but for years of unconscious bias masked as judicial procedure? The morning paper would be arriving soon. In a few hours, he would need to return to that courtroom, face another docket of cases. But he knew, with crushing certainty, that he could never view these routine cases the same way again. Judge Parker finally closed the last case file, his shoulders heavy with the weight of recognition. The sun was rising on a changed man, one who had been forced to confront his own prejudices in the harsh light of undeniable evidence. The question now was what he would do with this awakening. The Maxwell Library's fourth-floor conference room offered a neutral ground for what promised to be one of the most difficult conversations of Judge Parker's career. He arrived 15 minutes early, his usual judicial confidence replaced by an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. Through the room's glass walls, he could see students bustling between bookshelves, their academic pursuits continuing unchanged, while his entire worldview had been upended. Dr. Richardson arrived precisely on time, her presence transforming the modest conference room into something that felt more like a distinguished academic chamber. She carried the same messenger bag from court, but now he noticed the worn edges, a testament to years of scholarly work he failed to consider days ago. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Dr. Richardson," he began, his rehearsed speech already crumbling in the face of their shared reality. The formal title felt foreign on his tongue after his dismissive Ms. in court, but its use was deliberate, a small first step toward recognition and respect. "I appreciate you reaching out, Judge Parker," she responded, her tone professional, but not cold. She placed her bag on the table, the sound of papers shifting inside reminding him of the documentation he'd refused to review. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Through the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference table, like bars between them, a fitting metaphor for the barriers they needed to address. "I owe you more than an apology," he finally said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I've spent the past few days reviewing my cases, my patterns of behavior." He paused, gathering courage. "Your presentation at the symposium wasn't just brilliant. It was a mirror I needed to look into." Dr. Richardson studied him thoughtfully, her years of analyzing judicial behavior evident in her careful observation. "Many judges find it difficult to acknowledge these patterns," she offered, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "The system often mistakes consistency for fairness. I found the statistical analysis from your paper particularly." He searched for the right word. "Illuminating." He pulled out his own copy, now dog-eared and marked with yellow highlighter, "especially regarding what you termed routine dismissal patterns in municipal courts." A slight smile touched Dr. Richardson's lips, the academic in her recognizing a colleague engaging with her research, even under these circumstances. "Those patterns often become visible only when we're forced to confront them directly. Like when you discover you find a distinguished legal scholar for being exactly where she was supposed to be," Judge Parker admitted, the irony still stinging. Dr. Richardson reached into her bag, pulling out a familiar set of papers, the documentation from the parking incident. "Would you like to see them now?" she asked, not unkindly. The judge accepted the papers with slightly trembling hands, reading through the proper authorization she tried to show him in court. Each perfectly filed form felt like another crack in his former certainty. "You know," Dr. Richardson said, breaking the silence, "I've studied judicial bias for 20 years, but it's the personal stories that really illuminate the issue." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Would you be willing to share your perspective on what happened that day?" For the next hour, they talked, really talked, about bias, justice, and the subtle ways prejudice shapes even the most routine decisions. Judge Parker shared his sleepless night reviewing cases, while Dr. Richardson offered insights from her years of research and personal experience. As their conversation drew to a close, Dr. Richardson said something that would stay with him. "True justice requires us to be students as much as arbiters. Sometimes the best lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." The late afternoon sun had shifted, dissolving the shadow bars between them. As they prepared to leave, Judge Parker realized this conversation wasn't an ending, but a beginning, the start of a different kind of judicial education, one that no law school had ever offered. 6 months after his meeting with Dr. Richardson, courtroom 302 had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The harsh fluorescent lights remained, but Judge William Parker's approach to justice had shifted fundamentally. Today, he sat at his bench reviewing case files with a different kind of attention, conscious of the weight each decision carried. "Your Honor," his clerk approached with a stack of statistics. "The quarterly review you requested is ready." What had begun as personal curiosity had evolved into systematic monitoring of his own judicial patterns. Every fine, every ruling, every interaction was now documented and analyzed for potential bias. The morning docket included another parking violation at Maxwell Library. As the defendant approached the podium, Judge Parker noticed his younger self wanting to rush through what would once have been a routine case. Instead, he took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Richardson's words about justice beginning with simple acknowledgement. "Please," he gestured to the nervous student before him, "explain your situation." The words felt different now, carrying genuine invitation rather than perfunctory procedure. His clerk noticed the change, smiling slightly as she continued her documentation. In the gallery, a group of law students observed the proceedings, part of a new judicial transparency initiative he'd implemented. Their professor, a colleague of Dr. Richardson's, had specifically requested they witness what she called active bias awareness in practice. During the lunch recess, Judge Parker reviewed the latest data from his court watching program. Volunteer law students now track judicial interactions, filing reports on everything from interruption patterns to fine disparities. What had started as his personal redemption had evolved into a model program for judicial self-regulation. His phone buzzed, an email from Dr. Richardson. She'd been keeping in touch, offering guidance as he developed new protocols for his courtroom. Her latest research paper, Transformation Through Recognition, a case study in judicial evolution, had just been published. He was both humbled and proud to know that his courtroom's changes had contributed to the study. The afternoon session brought a case that would have once been a simple maximum fine. Now, Judge Parker listened carefully as the defendant explained their circumstances, noting how his newly implemented documentation-first policy had already changed the dynamic of the interaction. The young clerk who had witnessed his confrontation with Dr. Richardson months ago now managed a systematic filing protocol that gave every defendant's documentation equal consideration. Court is adjourned, he announced at day's end, but his work wasn't finished. The evening would include a judicial training session where he'd share his experience. The story of his encounter with Dr. Richardson had become a powerful teaching tool, though he always presented himself as the one who needed to learn. In his chambers, he reviewed an invitation to speak at next year's Governor's Law Symposium, this time as a presenter rather than an attendee. The topic, Implementing Systematic Bias Checks in Municipal Courts. The irony wasn't lost on him. Before leaving, he paused to adjust the new addition to his office wall, a framed quote from Dr. Richardson's latest paper. Justice is not merely about making decisions, but about examining how we make them. It had replaced his old Distinguished Service plaque, serving as a daily reminder of how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. The sun was setting as Judge Parker gathered his things, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to apply what he'd learned. The routine cases that he'd once rushed through now received the same careful consideration as major trials. As he walked to his car, he passed the Maxwell Library parking area, the spot where this journey had begun. The sign still read 2-hour parking, but now it also displayed information about obtaining extended permits. Small changes, perhaps, but representative of a larger transformation in how justice was administered in his corner of the legal system. The changes in Courtroom 302 wouldn't make headlines or change the entire judicial system overnight. But for every person who entered seeking justice, the difference was clear. They faced a judge who had learned to see them before judging them.